It's genuinely commendable that for about 30 lakhs, you can get cars like the Tata Harrier EV and the Mahindra XEV 90 from homegrown Indian car makers that are as good as anything else in the world. But today we're here to find out which of these is the best and how do they perform, and to be honest, which one should be your pick. The Harrier EV is familiar following the proportions and substantial presence of the ICE model. A lot of this is down to it being a significant 225mm wider and 46mm taller than the XEV90. The Mahindra conversely makes a big show of it, even though it's shorter and narrower than the Harrier. It's bold and stands out, helped by the long coupe silhouette that seems to enhance the fact that it is 182mm longer than the Harrier EV. Now with the Harrier EV, it's great that even with this dual motor version, you do get a small 35-litre space to put stuff in the front of the car. But with the Mahindra, it's really a much more usable space, and this is one of the attributes that you have, or advantages of having a fully born electric architecture. You have a deep 150-litre Frunk and you can genuinely use it. It's not just for cables or some other small stuff like in the Harrier. And I also like how usable it is. It's on gas struts. It has that double latch mechanism. So it's much more usable to use on the everyday than the one in the Harrier. You have enough ground clearance in both. The Harrier EV has 205mm and the XEV90 has 207mm. Although we wish there was a bit less gloss black going around in the Mahindra, around spots that get easily scuffed, and that the LED signatures on the Harrier EV were better aligned and more vibrant. Now the XEV has a more spacious boot as well. Now considering how big and large these panels are on these cars, this powered function really does help in both, and I must say that the space is well managed. Now remember, these are electric vehicle platforms, so they're built a bit differently, which is why you have this quite large high sill. But this is very important for India. You get a spare wheel in both cars, although I must say that it's a bit nicely packaged here, and the space with its flattish kind of floor really is useful. Yes, the height may not be all that great considering the sloping roofline, but you will get some decent luggage into the 663 litres that the XEV90 has. Now coming to the Harrier, it's again sort of ICE-derived platform. Does mean that there are some compromises, and the boot is one of them. So you'll notice that the spare wheel is kind of there, but packed in like this, which raises the floor. And generally the entire space is a lot lesser than the ICE Harrier and also a lot lesser than the XEV. It's about 502 litres. Now both the spaces are calculated right to the roof. Yes, in the Harrier you can maybe put taller luggage or stack luggage higher, which will be helpful. And with the rear view camera that you have, you can literally actually stack it up to the roof, so that won't be a problem. But there's no real space to put the charging cable, which can get somewhat irritating, but you can then put it in the front. Now having said that, both give you a 60-40 split function, so you can maximize space to a large extent in both. Now both of these are fairly expensive cars, especially the top end versions that we have here. But in the XEV, as soon as you step inside, it seems to make you feel like a car that's closer to the price that it's asking you for it. And yes, this full screen layout does have that sense of occasion to it, but it's the smaller details that really give you that slightly better feeling of quality in the cabin. Now to start with, the soft surfaces seem a bit more apparent than in the Harrier. For example, all of these panels are soft. And to be honest, there may not be too much more of it than in the Tata, but it's just placed, I think, a little bit better. Similarly, the details, like I mentioned, the stitching that you have here, the kind of tactile controls for the plastic switchgear that is there, there's not too much of it. And generally, that also continues with the kind of seat upholstering that you have and the kind of fit and finish, at least in the top half of the dash. And I also must say, I really like the headlining and this arrangement here. It's a step better than what you get in the Tata. The Harrier EV has many soft panels and uses contrasting finishes better. Just like the outside, the dash is closely derived from the ICE Harrier, so it's a well finished space that seems as well put together as the Mahindra, just not as apparently. The white and blue theme gives it a fresh touch. The Harrier EV is the easier cabin to interact with on the move, but we wish both cars had much less gloss black on the inside than they do. The plastic quality and finish in the lower reaches of the dash could also be more consistent in both. Now Mahindra and Tata have usually not been known for the best in-cabin practicality, but with these cars there has been some improvement. Now In the center console, there isn't much space, especially when it comes to cup holders. But the XEV90 gives you this big covered panel here where you can actually store a lot of stuff, and the wireless charger is a bit easier to access. In the Harrier, you do find that it's in a bit of a nook, but in both you will be able to fit a sizable phone. Now the Harrier though gets many more charge ports. You get Type A and Type C both, not just the two here but two also here, and a 12-volt outlet. Now the Mahindra for some reason has a 12-volt outlet only in the boot and just two Type-C ports in the front. Both give you Type-C ports at the back, so that's not a concern. Now I must say that the Harrier also gives you larger door pockets. You actually can hold a lot of stuff in them. The Harrier EV and XEV90 are especially generous with their tech. You have all manner of functions built in, although the most useful ones are the rear camera in the Harrier EV and the head-up display in the Mahindra XEV90. The screen layout differs quite a bit. The Mahindra gives you three 12.3-inch screens, while the Harrier EV has a 12.25-inch driver's display and a large 14.5-inch Samsung OLED touchscreen. The Tata's large screen real estate is a positive, and it's also the more thoughtfully laid out interface. The ADAS, climate and sound settings are easier to access than in the Mahindra, for example. The Mahindra is the more responsive one though. Inputs register quicker and it also seems to fire up your phone a little bit quicker. The main advantage of the passenger screen is that it lets you access social apps and content on the move, which the Harrier can only do at a standstill. The polarized film keeps it from distracting the driver. As for the driver displays, the Tata has more information, but the Mahindra is better laid out. The fonts are a bit too small in the Harrier EV. The XEV90 conversely innovatively gives you a good sense of what's happening quicker. And also, usually we're not very fond of this touch panel in Tata cars, but here with the completely bare, no button sort of approach of the XEV90, the controls are definitely easier to reach, especially the climate controls on a hot day like today where you're constantly working the fan. It's much easier in the Harrier than in the XEV90. Having said that, the Harrier also gives you the slightly better or more supportive front seat. But now they have improved this steering sort of arrangement in the Harrier. The horn is a bit easier to use. It's also been beefed up, but it's nowhere near as nice to use as in the XEV90 where you have the horn controls right on the sides. Tata used to do this earlier. For example, the Punch still has it where you have buttons for the horn right here. And you do tend to sort of hit these switches quite a bit while driving, which doesn't happen in the Mahindra. These cars impress, but sadly both could be more reliable. Having these cars around had us chasing one problem fix after the next. The Mahindra's soft close boot stopped working and the park button on the selector would sometimes get stuck, making the car immobile. The Harrier EV would stop detecting its key often, leaving it stranded too. That being said, these cars are safe. Both get 5-star ratings and a whole host of safety features. The Harrier also gets the transparent bonnet function and has the clearer cameras. As for the level 2 ADAS system, the one on the Mahindra is a bit more intrusive with its alerts than the Tata. But you can fully turn off this system unlike the Tata. Here's a look at all the other features you get with these cars. Now the Mahindra has a 2775mm wheelbase, that's about 34mm longer than the Harrier. But you might think that with the coupe shape of the XEV90, it may not have the better backseat. But it's not quite that. You'll notice that with the long tail that it has, headroom is not very different from the Harrier. And you will notice them, say, if you're closer to 6 feet tall, but for my height, I'm about 5'7", and there's really not much to choose between the two cars in that respect. Now, where the XEV9E continues to score is in the width of the seat. Even though it's a narrower car than the Harrier, the seat itself is slightly wider. So 3 abreast is good in both cars, but here the middle passenger will be just a little bit better off. And that's also helped by the flat seat cushioning that the XEV9E has. That's a very typical Mahindra trait. You see that here as well. The larger sunroof gives you a great sense of space in the XEV90, and you also get a wireless charger and an integrated device holder. Both cars give you sunshades and high power Type-C ports. We also think the B-pillar mounted vents in the Harrier are a bit more effective. Now coming to the legroom, of course, both give you this boss function. Here it's manuals and you don't get the option to tilt the seat forward in that sense. In the Harrier, it's powered throughout, so it's a lot easier to use on the move. And I also like the fact that you can actually recline the seat to a genuinely comfortable angle in the XEV 9e. Now coming to the bits that the Harrier does better, while the 9e does give you this middle headrest, the Harrier has those foldable sort of headrests and they're genuinely quite comfortable. Now me personally, I don't quite like the cushioning in the Harrier. I think the thigh support could be slightly better compared to the 9e. The XEV 9e has a larger battery pack at 79 kWh using blade battery cells sourced from BYD. The Harrier EV uses prismatic cells but is slightly smaller at 75 kWh. The Mahindra's born electric architecture and efficiency-focused shape seem to make it more efficient, especially at higher speeds. These factors mean that it has a range advantage in the city over the Harrier EV, which grows in highway driving. In a real-world range test, as you can see here, the XEV 9e did better than the Harrier EV both in the city and on the highway. The Tata has the more dynamic range indicator, which helps you plan charging better. The XEV 9e can DC fast charge at 175 kilowatts, while the Harrier EV can do up to 130 kilowatts. When you do find a fast enough charger, this will make a difference. The Mahindra more practically also does AC charging quicker at 11 kilowatt against the Harrier EV 7.2 kilowatt. Now once you start driving these cars, especially in the kind of conditions that we've driven in today, typical Mumbai traffic, urban scenarios, you will find that it's the Harrier that's a little bit easier to place. You can see out of it a little bit better, just the way the bonnet is shaped. This A-pillar is quite intrusive in both, but a bit less in the Harrier. Same with the mirrors, both cars have quite large mirrors, which again sort of get in the way. And then of course you have this rear camera setup, which has been much talked about in the Harrier. And I must say that it really does help, especially with all the views that you get. It's a good addition. But I do wish Tata Motors had worked a bit more on refinement. At high temperatures, you sometimes find that there's a bit more vibrations coming into the cabin when, say, the battery's cooling fan has been activated, which doesn't quite happen in the Mahindra. And generally, I do wish you had a bit less wind and tire noise going around. With its dual motor setup, the Harrier EV is the more potent car here. It makes 158 PS from its front motor and 238 PS from the rear, with combined torque being a significant 504 Nm. The XEV 9e is some way behind at 285 PS and 380 Nm. It's no surprise that the Harrier EV did a 0 to 100 kmph run in 6.3 seconds and the XEV 9e in 6.9 seconds. Now the Harrier in this all-wheel drive dual motor variant has a distinct power and torque advantage over the XEV 9e. You still get that only in a single rear-driven variant. This shows in our tested 0 to 100 kmph times, the Harrier EV is quick by any yardstick, doing it in 6.3 seconds, while the Mahindra is a little way behind at 6.9 seconds. But once you start driving these, it's the Mahindra that feels a little bit more energetic and a little bit more agile in that sense, a little bit more responsive. And that's really down to how these companies have tuned their sort of EV powertrain. Now in the Harrier, there's quite a bit more heft that's going on in the system, and the responses have been toned down a little bit, probably to make life easy for you if you aren't used to this kind of power. The Tata puts its power down in a slightly soft, measured way that is easy to control. The Mahindra conversely seems to have more precision in the throttle pedal and a sharper response that makes it feel lighter and more agile. This comes up in the rolling acceleration times where there's little to choose between the two. But the Harrier's power advantage is more apparent at triple-digit cruising, where it seems more comfortable holding these speeds than the XEV, although both have no problems getting up to these speeds. Now you have drive and traction modes in all the cars, and they do change the kind of outputs that you get and the overall responses of the systems. And it's a bit odd, but these cars aren't the most efficient in their most efficient drive modes. For example, the Harrier has an eco mode and the Mahindra has a range mode, but it's actually in their default mode. The city in this one, and default as they call it in the Mahindra, is where the car feels the best. It's in both those modes. You can pretty much use these cars in every situation, the everyday modes, and generally the car feels more cohesive and well-rounded in these modes. Now coming back to how they build performance in the Harrier, like I said, off the line it's a bit softer. a bit more mellow, and that continues throughout the power band, so to speak. Even in the most potent boost mode, you now find that the car becomes sharper or twitchier. In the Mahindra too, it's very well controlled, but you do find that sometimes spins up its wheels. You have to be a little bit careful with the kind of inputs that you put in, which again, if you like driving, you'll really enjoy because everything is very well controlled in all the cars. The Regen systems work similarly in both with 4 levels, but we found the calibration to be a bit more intuitive in the Harrier EV. You can stick it in level 1 as an all-purpose setting. In the XEV, there is a touch less braking effect at this setting in some situations, while level 2 can be quite strong in steady driving. There is a one-pedal mode in the Mahindra, but it takes a bit of getting used to if you are coming from an ICE vehicle, and again could be better calibrated as far as these systems go. Now with these new born electric SUVs, Mahindra has talked a lot about how they are good drivers cars, and in this comparison, the XEV is the better one if you like driving. Yes, the Harrier is the more comfortable car, but that has brought with it some compromises. To start with, the steering is the most apparent. In the Harrier, you don't quite feel as connected as you do in this. With this one, the steering is a lot more direct. It's quicker, which means that you need to make a smaller input for the car to make a similar amount of turn. And it also has that variable ratio thing going on. So on tighter corners or longer corners, that really does come in. You do feel a lot more connected to the road, and that continues with the handling setup, so to speak. So you find that the Mahindra is a lot more eager to turn in. It does turn in these kind of flyovers or even corners. It's managing its weight a lot better, leaning in a lot more progressively, a lot more predictably, which makes for a much more enjoyable experience. In the Harrier, you have to always be a bit mindful of the car's mass. But here in the Mahindra, you can really hustle it a little bit harder and still feel that you're in control. The Harrier EV makes up some ground with the added grip that its all-wheel drive system offers. The system only cuts in when necessary and the integration is smooth, so the Harrier feels more predictable when you are on the power and adds a sense of security that feels helpful here. The Tata is more confident under heavy braking as well. It stops better as our numbers show, but it's also more stable in these situations. The XEV can lose a bit of composure here even though it actually dives less. Now if you are looking for an EV that you want to be driven around in, the Harrier EV starts to make a lot of sense in that regard when you notice just how plush it rides. Now remember, we're driving the top spec versions of both cars and both of them ride 19-inch wheels. Now with that in mind, and considering that EVs are generally heavier, the suspensions need to be firmed up a little bit to manage all that weight, they're not the most comfortable cars around. The Harrier EV and XEV90 come with quite advanced suspension setups to counter this. These are multi-link setups, the kind you usually found only in more expensive European cars until very recently, and they also get frequency selective damping. Now the Harrier sort of changes that perception. It's genuinely plush in the way that it handles our roads. So say you're on a fairly smooth road such as this one, you notice the car remains a bit steadier, a bit flatter than the XEV90 on these kind of roads. And then when the roads do get rough, yes, the suspension is noisy in both, a little bit more in the Tata, but the way this car sort of cocoons you and keeps you away from all the bad stuff that's happening outside is genuinely commendable. You really don't notice the bumps. Definitely not as much as the XEV90 because that is quite firmly set up given that it's a slightly sportier car. Now, even though both these cars have that tough, rugged feel that their brands are known for, this one just keeps you a little bit more comfortable. In the Mahindra, you get thrown around a little bit more, which, say, if you're going over an extended set of bad patches, can get a bit tiring after a point. The Mahindra XEV90 and Tata Harrier EV run each other close. The two may seem similar on paper, but they appeal to very different sets. The Harrier EV is the more practical car, which will appeal to those prioritizing comfort and a calm, soft driving experience. The XEV90 brings with it a greater sense of occasion. It's quite engaging to drive and will be great for those who want an EV but don't want to let go of the traditional sense of excitement a car brings. The Harrier EV's trump card is its price, which lets it edge out the XEV90. At Rs 29.48 lakh, you get all-wheel drive for 50,000 less than the similarly equipped Mahindra at Rs 31 lakh. The equivalent rear-wheel drive Harrier EV is a massive Rs 3 lakhs less.